Good evening. Welcome back to A Reasonable Answer for the Hope that we have. This is our 8. It's about the historical reliability of the New Testament documents, part 2. Last week we started looking at that, part 1. Again, just to review things real quick. Okay. Last week we began looking at part 1, which was the bibliographical test, and that means we're looking at how the documents from which our New Testament comes from came down to us through history. And I introduced you to the Tübingen theory, which is the first attack we looked at against Christian faith. And the Tübingen theory, in a simple paragraph, says that Jesus was born to a simple carpenter, and after he died, people began to tell stories about him, and after time passed, these stories became enhanced, and that slowly, the carpenter's son turned into the Son of God, and long after all the eyewitnesses were gone, and finally it was recorded and distributed, and that's how we get these incredible stories in the Gospels. Then we began to look at, well, how did this come down to us? Who originally recorded the event? And these will directly refute that theory, and it's been refuted for decades now, but it's amazing that people still want to use it. Who originally recorded the events, the time lapse between the event and when it was first recorded, which is key to the Tübingen theory, the time lapse between the original document and the age of the oldest existing copy from which we rely for our Bible, and the number of existent copies of any significant antiquity. Those are the main questions. There were some others. We looked at the first century fathers of the church. And these men are directly related to John and some of the other apostles. Appius, Bishop of Hierapolis, and Polycarp, Bishop of Smyrna, were direct disciples, directly taught by John the Apostle. Ignatius, Bishop of Antioch, was a direct disciple of Polycarp, taught by Polycarp, but he also had met John and some of the other apostles, and Irenaeus, Bishop of Lyons, was a student of Polycarp. So these men, the point is, these men are very, very close to the crucifixion and those who wrote about it. They were certainly in a position to know something about who wrote the Gospels and the other books we find in the New Testament. So it was interesting to see what they say, and I'll just give one example. This is from Ignatius. Matthew published his Gospel, not told about it, and it was passed down for 10 generations until it was finally recorded. He published his Gospel. When Peter and Paul were preaching the Gospel in Rome, Mark, the disciple interpreter of Peter, himself handed down to us in writing the substance of Peter's preaching. Luke, the follower of Paul, set down in a book the gospel preached by his teacher. Then John himself produced his gospel. So much for the Tübingen theory. But there's more. The writers themselves claim to be eyewitnesses, and we looked at a number of scriptures that verify that. But here are the dates that virtually all historians today admit to. And you see, it's not 2nd or 3rd century. The thing that you should remember from all of this is that the documents from which our Bible, our New Testament, come from, all of the writing was finished well before the end of the 1st century. In fact, by 110, many of these books were bound together and were being circulated to the churches. By 110. Where do we get the other things from? Well, our oldest copies, important. There are two types of copies we have. We have fragments, which are what you would expect, and then we have codices, which are in book form, not scrolls, and they're typically pretty much the whole New Testament, very often the whole Bible. The most important fragments are the John Rowland manuscript, the Chester Beatty Papyri, and the Bodmer Papyrus II. And you can see the span over there between the close of the writing of the New Testament, around 80 to 90 AD, and when these copies were made. And they're incredibly close to the originals, 30 years for the John Rowland manuscript, 60 to 100 or so for the other two. There are literally tens of thousands of fragments available today. These are just the most important ones, the most complete one. As you see, they pretty well established the Gospel of John. Chester Beatty has most of the New Testament, so that's a pretty big fragment, actually. We looked at the codices, the complete books, and the oldest of those range from about 260 to 410 after the close of the writing of the New Testament. Those numbers may bother you a little bit until you look at them compared to some other things. And I've listed here some classical works whose authenticity is unquestioned. Unquestioned. And you can see, we skipped forward one. I don't know how. There we go. Okay, right there. I don't know how I do that. You can see that the span there is absolutely incredible. 1,400 years for Sophocles, 1,200 for Plato, Julius Caesar, 1,000. We read some stuff from Pliny the Second or Pliny the Younger, 750 years. The only one that even comes anywhere in the range of the New Testament is Livy, 300 years. But that's not the whole story. It's important to know something about the number of copies in order to get rid of scribal errors. And we see that there were 13,000 ancient copies of the New Testament documents. 13,000. In addition to that, there were 32,000 quotations written in letters by the church fathers, early church fathers, before 325 AD. And then, forward again. Well, anyway, well, back one, please. Okay. All right, I guess I skipped that. The other thing I was going to mention is that many of these things have very few copies. I thought I had the other one in here. I guess I don't. Have very few copies, like 1 to 7 for many of the classics. The most of any of the classics was 100 copies of any age at all. And so you see, it's not an exaggeration to say that this book here, in terms of historical reliability, in terms of the process by which we got it, is literally thousands of times better than anything else from antiquity. And that's what Will Durant agrees with. He's a history professor, was at Columbia. He's not a believer. And yet he says higher criticism is applied to the New Testament tests of authenticity so severe that by them 100 worthies such as Hammurabi, David, and Socrates would fade into legend. And so he insists that the Bible is good history because he wouldn't have a job otherwise. All right, tonight, second part, historical reliability of the New Testaments, and we want to look at the external data. We have shown that through the bibliographical test that the New Testament has been transmitted down to modern times by an impeccable process, literally unapproached by any of the other works from history. So we can be sure that what we have accurately represents the originals. We have copies that came from shortly after the originals were written. We have very, very many copies to get rid of scribal errors. They're all in good shape. We have all the books. We know that it represents the originals. The question remains, though, how accurate were the originals? And to get at this question, we want to look at the external data, okay? So, the external evidence is of two types. There is evidence from secular contemporary histories, and some of these you were introduced to 2 weeks ago when we looked at the historical Jesus. We'll look at some others, and we'll look at some of those in a different context. And secondly, there's archaeological evidence. And we'll talk about how these mesh together as we go along. Let's look first at comparisons with secular history. All right? So what we're going to do is we're going to look at events or situations that are discussed in the New Testament. And there are times, not always, but there are cases where secular history treats these same events. And it's interesting to compare them for differences, for likenesses. I should say something about titles in the Roman Empire first. You know, if you go throughout the United States and you go to Nebraska or Montana, and the head man in each of those or any other state will be called governor. Not so in the Roman Empire. There were a lot of titles in the Roman Empire. Two of them that we'll be concerned with mostly is, and I think I've got something here. Yes, if it was a province, there were two basic differences in the provinces. About 29 BC, the emperor divided the province into two types. Those that were easily defensible, he put under the sponsorship or the control of the Roman Senate. Those that were more difficult, hotspots like Judea, which was in Asia, or provinces that were on the edge of the empire that were subject to attack, he kept under control of himself. So you have senatorial provinces and imperial provinces. A senatorial province, in a senatorial province, the governor was called a proconsul. In an imperial province, the governor was called an imperial legate or a procreator. So Pontius Pilate was called a procreator. Judea was an imperial province, Asia, which Judea was part of. Okay, so, and these things change back and forth sometimes. So you had to be on your toes when you talked about officials in the Roman Empire. And it's instructive to see how Luke handles this. Luke is our most historical type of source. Luke writes more like a historian than anybody else because he puts a lot of benchmarks in what he writes. We'll see some of those. So the correct use of titles is important. And for instance, on Cyprus, Cyprus was originally a province administered by the emperor, and the governor would have been called an imperial legate or a procreator. In 22 BC, it became a senatorial province. I guess it calmed down and was easier controlled and was governed by a proconsul. And so we see in Luke, Acts 13:7, Luke correctly refers to the governor of Cyprus, whom Barnabas and Paul met, as the proconsul Sergius Paulus. So Luke is correct even in this province where it changed. If these documents had been written 100 or 200 years later, there are things that happened that would have been almost impossible to correctly sort out after the fact. Cognizance of political environments. Luke reports, when you remember when in Acts when Paul was in Ephesus, and he converted so many of the people there away from the worship of Diana or Artemis that the silversmiths got upset. It was hurting their business, and so there was a riot. You remember? And they went to the amphitheater, and this riot was happening, and the city clerk gets up to calm them down, and he says, if you have a complaint, there are proconsuls You might want to check this. Acts 19:38. The word is plural. Can that be right? Did Luke make a mistake? Would you say the governors, plural, of Alabama? Does this maybe validate people's concerns that maybe Luke wasn't on top of everything and he wrote too late? Does it indicate a lack of understanding of what was going on in the first century? Quite the contrary. You see, even though Roman senatorial provinces were governed by only one proconsul at a time, never more than one, normally, historical records indicate that a few months prior to this, the proconsul of Asia, Junius Silanus, had been assassinated. And it's interesting, he was assassinated by two men and this was prior to the riot. Well, let me just go in my order here. I'm probably better without these things. So he was assassinated, and at the time that Paul was there and the riot occurred, a replacement has not been found yet. And so the most interesting thing is he had been assassinated by two men at the instruction of Agrippina, the mother of Nero. And she's a real case. But so Luke was correct. Now, during the interim, before a new proconsul was appointed, the two assassins were looking out for the affairs of the state. They were serving as governors. And this only happened for a few months until a new man was appointed. So Luke is correct. Even in this minute case of a plural, under very unusual circumstances, he's correct. It's something you probably would have not known 200 years later without going and doing a lot of research in the archives. Okay, let's look at archaeology, and first let's talk a little bit about the role of archaeology. First of all, it seldom provides complete stories. You know, if you want to know the whole story, it's a lot better to find a document or a book or something, or a scroll. So that's kind of the downside of archaeology. It's usually limited in scope. On the other hand, the data that that's because it comes from things like inscriptions on stones, tombstones, monuments, statues, buildings, and so forth. Occasionally, you find a story told on a wall in Egypt and things like that, but most of the time, it's fairly limited in scope. However, the data that you do have is irrefutable. You see, if it's carved in stone, so to speak, it's not subject, first of all, to scribal errors. That's the original. And secondly, it's not subject to drift as people's political concerns change, or their religious concerns change, or whatever. Or a lot of times things that are written and copied and copied and copied, sometimes the copiers put their own biases into it. This cannot happen in the case of archaeological evidence. It's literally carved in stone, real time at the time of the event, and that it stays like that. And then it's dug up. You have an original piece of evidence. So that's the upside. Provides invaluable benchmark data. It comes of two types. There are data that are in general accord with the New Testament, for example. In other words, it agrees or it supports a situation. We'll look at some examples and you'll see what I mean. But it doesn't necessarily deal with specifics. But it can show that the mentality of the people was such that they would have had a riot over certain things that they cared about. Kind of like the mentality of Auburn and Alabama fans, when you put them all together in one stadium. That sort of thing, as opposed to a bunch of nuns. Okay? And then there's evidence that directly corroborates a specific event, person, place, or fact given in the written record. And we'll look at both types of these. So, let's first, the general archaeological test of the New Testament. There's a reference in 1 Corinthians 10:25 to meat market. Okay? Now, this is not too exciting, but nevertheless, when they excavated Corinth, the old city of Corinth, they found a marker with that Greek word on it, which means meat market. So, at least there was what Luke claims was there. It'll get more exciting. Paul debated in the synagogue at Corinth, Acts 18:7-4. Well, again, when they excavated Corinth, they found a marker that was over the door of a building, and it said Synagogue of the Hebrews. So the Hebrew people, the Jews, had a synagogue in Corinth. Let's look at titles of officials again. You remember we talked about the complexity of titles in the Roman Empire, such as proconsuls and imperial legates and all that kind of stuff. Publius, the chief man of the island. That's the way Luke refers to him in Acts 28:7, the island of Cyprus, I believe it is. And for generations, this was thought to be kind of an unusual name and probably an error on Luke's part. But archaeology comes along, and this title, they found inscriptions. I'm sorry, it was Malta, not Cyprus. Malta, that have confirmed the leader of the island was indeed referred to as the first man. So after a number of generations of thinking Luke was in error, he has been vindicated by archaeology. And so you begin to see how a little piece of data can confirm something, and if you have confidence that Luke knows what he's talking about, then you can trust the rest of what he writes a lot more. Politarchs of Thessalonica, Acts 17:6. And again, it's another title used by Luke for civil authorities, and again, it was considered to be in error because there was no reference to politarchs in the classical literature. And if there's you'll see a principle here. If there is a deviation, if there is a disagreement between Scripture and the classical literature is always taken to be correct for generations, until archaeology comes along, an archaeologist, and he digs something up, and they have dug up 19 inscriptions that use this term politarchs. I don't care if it wasn't used in classical literature. They dug up these inscriptions that date back to that time, and 5 of those refer to politarchs of Thessalonica. Luke's vindicated. Okay, there was a riot caused in Acts 21, 27 through 32. There was a rumor that Paul had taken Gentiles into the temple. And it caused the whole city to get upset, and a riot ensued. And Paul was dragged off and held in prison by the Romans, and this was the beginning of his trip to Rome and ultimate execution, I think. According to Josephus, now this is classic literature, not archaeology. According to Josephus, who I introduced a couple of weeks ago, notices in Greek and Latin were posted on the barricade that separates the inner and outer courts of the temple, warning Gentiles that death would be the penalty for violating the temple or trespassing into the inner court. In fact, he says that the Romans were so interested in placating the Jews and taking care of their susceptibilities, that they agreed that the Jews could make this a death penalty even for Roman citizens. Highly unusual. So says Josephus. Well, one of these inscriptions has been found. It's written in Greek, now housed in Istanbul. It was found in 1871 by C.S. Claremont Gana. And here's what it says. No foreigner may enter within the barricade which surrounds the temple and enclosure. Anyone who is caught doing so will have himself to thank for his ensuing death. Cute, huh? And another copy was found and is now housed in Israel in the Palestine Archaeological Museum. It was found about 60 years later. So, the point is that this confirms the sensibilities of the Jews. Taking a Gentile into the temple would have been a flashpoint for them. And so what Luke writes, it doesn't confirm that that riot occurred, but it certainly confirms the mentality of the Jewish people and that a riot could easily have happened like that. Okay, one other thing of interest, in Ephesians 2:14, Paul writes, in part, who has made the two one, talking about Gentiles and Jews, and has destroyed the barrier, the wall of hostility. And I've always wondered, this is just for free, if he's referring to this wall. Was he using it as an analogy? You know, just as this barrier was a physical barrier between Jews and Gentiles, so the law of Moses was a spiritual barrier between them. Okay, the riot at Ephesus, while we're on riots. Acts 19:23. And I just mentioned this a while ago. The riot was caused by the silversmiths who were concerned about their business going down because Paul was converting all these worshipers of Diana over to Christianity, and they weren't buying idols anymore. An inscription was excavated in Ephesus which states that silver statues of Artemis, or Diana in the King James, are to be placed in the theater during a full session of the ecclesia. Now, ecclesia doesn't mean it's the church. You know, ecclesia is a Greek word that just at that time meant assembly. It could be the city council, for example. And that's what he's referring to. So, what does this confirm for us? It confirms, does it not, that first of all, they met in the theater. Secondly, that there were silver statues of Diana. It verifies the silversmith's trade, which the riot was all about. In addition, the theater for Ephesus the amphitheater was excavated and has a seating capacity of 25,000. So you could easily have a riot in a theater that large. Again, these are not specifics, but they are things that are in general agreement or accord with the New Testament that show that what Luke is writing about is not, it's completely in the realm of possibility or probability. Okay. All right, let's look at some specific things from archaeology. The birth of Jesus, Luke 2:1-3. And as I say, Luke is a real historian. His description fixes this event in time 4 ways. Now, of course, back in the first century, you couldn't say, well, Jesus was born in 8 or 9 BC. They didn't know what BC was then, or AD. So you had to fix time other ways. And typically people said, well, this happened in the 10th year of the reign of King such and such. And they might, and then you go from there, and if you want to know when that is relative to now, you have to go back and trace all the kings. Luke does this in 4 different ways, not just one. So, first of all, he tells us Augustus was Caesar, during the reign of Augustus Caesar. Secondly, Augustus had decreed that all the empire should be taxed. And he said this was the first time. And thirdly, all persons were required to return to their hometowns to register. And fourthly, he says Quirinius was governor of Syria then. All right? So people took issue with this. For a long time, they denied that any census was taken. They denied that people were required to go home to register. Those two are a little bit in conflict. But I guess logic's not a strong suit in these things. Quirinius was not governor of Syria at the time, they claim. And this is because Josephus, again, going back to Josephus, said that Quirinius was governor of Syria in AD 6. And Christ was born in about BC 8 or 9. Not 0, by the way. The monk made a mistake. Well, let's look what's been found. A papyrus was found in Egypt, and here's what it tells us. Because of the approaching census, it is necessary that all those residing for any cause away from their homes should at once prepare to return to their own governments in order that they may complete the family registration of the enrollment and that the tilled lands may retain those belonging to them. They did have census. They did have to go home and register. So, Romans periodically took a census, and they required all people to return to their ancestral homes to register. Subsequent archaeological discoveries have firmly established that the Romans did this regularly every 14 years, and the first one, am I getting ahead? Yeah, the first one was either in 23-22 BC or 9 or 8 BC. And of course, Luke tells us it's the first one, and Jesus was born in that second period there. So, the latter one's in agreement with Luke. But Luke's been vindicated on all these points. Lysanias, the Tetrarch of Abilene, Luke says he was Tetrarch when John began his ministry in AD 27. Well, the only Lysanias known through ancient times was killed in 36 BC. So that's a little bit of a stretch. Well, again, Luke was assumed to be in error. And you see this pattern. It's always the Scripture that's in error if there's a disagreement. However, an inscription unearthed at Damascus states in part, freedman, this guy was a slave that was made free, and he says, freedman of Lysanias the Tetrarch, and it's dated AD 14, which is close enough. If he was a Tetrarch then, a few more years, he would have been Tetrarch when John came along. Again, Luke is validated, vindicated. Erastus, director of public works. And this is just kind of an offhand comment in Romans 16:23. Paul writes, Erastus, who is the city's director of public works, sends you greetings. Along with some other people. That's why it says send. Okay, so it's maybe not important, but it's interesting. Professor T.L. Shear in 1929 was excavating in Corinth, and he dug up a piece of the pavement that had been buried, and it has that inscription on it. And you all recognize that, right? My mother always tried to teach me Latin. She was an English teacher, and I never did. If they don't speak it, I don't learn it. But it translates, Erastus, curator of public buildings, laid this pavement at his own expense. And it's dated to the 1st century. Okay, there's this business of the location of 3 cities, and you probably need to turn to Acts 14:6 for this. It's a little bit complicated. Acts 14:6. This is on one of Paul's journeys, and it's one of these cities that he got run out of. Okay, here's what it says, NIV, and you may have something else. But they found out about, they were planning to do him in. And he says, but they found out about it and fled to the Lycaonian cities of Lystra and Derbe, and to the surrounding country, where they continued to preach the good news. Let me read it again. It says in 4, the people of the cities were divided. Some sided with the Jews, others with the apostles. There was a plot afoot among the Gentiles and Jews, together with their leaders, talking about strange bedfellows, to mistreat them and stone them. But they found out about it and fled to the Lycaonian cities of Lystra and Derbe. All right. As I say, this is a little bit subtle, but if we're sitting here in Huntsville and we get run out of town, and I say we fled to the Alabama cities of Birmingham and Tuscaloosa, that would be unnecessary, wouldn't it? Wouldn't really make a lot of sense. But if it was the Tennessee cities of Nashville and Chattanooga, that would make sense. Fled to the cities of Tennessee, Nashville and Chattanooga. The implication is clearly that these cities are that Derbe, Lystra and Derbe are in a different province than these two cities. I may be saying them backwards here. You see my point? If they were all in the same province, that would be a nonsensical statement. If they're going across the border to another province, to these two cities, then he says Lycaonian cities, implying the city where they are is not in Lycaonia. And everybody understood this because for generations, Luke again took it on the ear. They thought he was wrong. And they thought he was wrong because of Cicero, who was a Roman general and later historian, who indicated that Iconium was in Lycaonia also. They were in Lycaonium and they ran away to Lystra and Derbe, who were in Lycaonia. But the implication is Iconium is not. All right? And they say Cicero says that it is. And so Luke, of course, is wrong. Again. All right? In 1910, Sir William Ramsay, remember? Sir William Ramsay, world-famous archaeologist who was converted. He thought the Tübingen theory was true, and he was converted by his diggings in Palestine and his subsequent dependence on Luke's writings to help him out. In 1910, he found a monument that places the city of Iconium in the province of Phrygia. It was in a different province. Now let me show you, this finding is subsequently confirmed by several additional archaeological discoveries. So for generations, if you believe these ancient historical writings, the secular writings, you're going to be wrong. And if you think Luke has made a mistake and therefore the Bible is not the Word of God, you could lose your soul over this. But generations later, we found out it's the secular writer, Cicero, who was in error. Okay, so here's what it looks like. You got Asia, which is now Turkey, over here on the right. And you have Derbe, Lystra, and Iconium. And you see the two provinces of Phrygia and Lycaonia. So they're close together. But it turns out the upper one, Iconium, is in Phrygia, and the lower two, Lystra and Derbe, are in Lycaonia. That's the correct way. Cicero said they all three were in Lycaonia. All right. Gallio, the proconsul, Acts 18:12. In this verse, Luke refers to Gallio, the proconsul, while Paul was in Corinth. Okay, now, an inscription was found at Delphi that states in part as Lucius Junius Gallio. I'm sorry, I'm keep wanting to go to the astronomer. Lucius Junius Gallio, my friend, and the proconsul of Achaia. Now, where's Achaia? Well, again, here's the map. over here is Greece on the left, and you see where Corinth is there in that little isthmus. And it's in the province of Achaia. In fact, it was the provincial capital, I think. So this inscription found states that Gallio was the proconsul of Achaia, which would have included Corinth, where Paul was. Now, this is interesting because we know some things about this from external sources. Gallio's proconsulship. He took office in some year on July the 1st. That's when they reassigned proconsuls. His proconsulship lasted 1 year only. So from July 1st to July 1st. The Delphi inscription is dated AD 52. So we know when he was proconsul, he took office either on July 1st, AD 51, or July 1st, AD 52. That's the only two possibilities. Okay? Has my watch stopped or something? Everybody keeps looking. Okay. So his proconsul is in the bracket, the span July 1st, 51 to July 1st, 53. What about Paul's ministry in Corinth? Well, first of all, we know that it overlapped the proconsulship of Gallio. So we know for sure that Paul was in Corinth sometime between July 1st, 51 and July 1st, 53. We can nail that down. It's 0.6% accuracy today, just from this one little piece of rock with the inscription on it. And by the way, since we know that Paul's ministry in Corinth lasted 1.5 years, we can say that he could not have been in Corinth outside of the period January 50 to December 54, going out 1.5 years on either end of Gallio's proconsulship. So just to show you some of the things you can learn from these. Conclusion of archaeologists. Miller Burroughs, a professor at Yale University, says archaeology has in many cases refuted the views of modern critics. It has shown in a number of instances that their views rest on false assumptions and unreal artificial schemes of historical development. And by the way, what comes to mind when I read this is our friend from Emory University School of Theology, who says the way we got the Gospels was, remember, eating at Grandma's house, eating Grandma's recipes, and people start thinking about Grandma who's passed on, and they tell this story and that story and the other story, and finally somebody says, well, we really ought to write all this stuff down about Grandma. And he says, that's the process by which we got the Gospels. Artificial schemes of historical development. William F. Albright is a world-famous archaeologist from Johns Hopkins University. The excessive skepticism shown towards the Bible by important historical schools of the 8th and 9th centuries, certain phases of which still appear periodically, have been progressively discredited. Discovery after discovery have established the accuracy of innumerable details and have brought increased recognition to the value of the Bible as a source of history. Nelson Gluck says, he's a Jewish archaeologist, it may be stated categorically that no archaeological discovery has ever controverted a biblical reference, period. Sir Frederick Kenyon says archaeology has not yet said its last word, but the results already achieved confirm what faith would suggest, that the Bible can do nothing but gain from increased knowledge. And if it's true, if the Bible's true, then that's true, isn't it? And those who are false will be proven false. Sir William Ramsay says, I may fairly claim to have entered this investigation without prejudice in favor of the conclusion which I now seek to justify, beginning with a fixed idea that the work, Luke and Acts, were was a second-century composition, never relying on its evidence as trustworthy for first-century conditions. I gradually came to find it a useful ally in some obscure and difficult investigations, and maybe you can better appreciate that now. So in conclusion, the New Testament writers, Luke is particularly verifiable because he gives all these benchmarks in what he writes, are incredibly accurate in their statements of fact. Moreover, they record incidences, according to Will Durant, that would not be recorded by inventors. And you can think about a number of things. The apostles arguing about who's going to be number one in the kingdom and so forth. These writings have been proven trustworthy beyond any reasonable doubt. By cold, hard academic probing of the historical methods and irrefutable discoveries of archaeology. You remember we talked about logic. We don't prove a man absolutely guilty in court, even of murder. We're willing to take his life on the basis of inductive reasoning that shows that he is guilty beyond any reasonable doubt. The New Testament has been proven beyond any reasonable doubt. I don't think that scenarios involving a deceased grandmother and people telling stories about her conjure any kind of a reasonable doubt. I don't care who it is that says it. Having validated the New Testament documents and shown them to be far more historical than any of the classical documents, we can now legitimately use the statements of historical fact contained in the New Testament to investigate the purpose, the character, and the nature of the man Jesus. So had we done this, initially people would have cried foul. You know, you're using this friendly document written by his followers to validate his resurrection. Well, we can't go anywhere else but here to learn about his purpose, his teachings, and his resurrection. But that's not an excuse to use it. But what we've shown is this is literally the finest book of history you can put your hands on. There's probably not another book that was documented to this level, and certainly not any of the writings from ancient history. They're far behind this, which is what you would expect if there really is a God and this really is His Word. So, next week, we will begin to look at Jesus, the Son of God. Was He really? You know, we haven't shown that yet. We can show that this is historical. We can show it's historical. We can show that Jesus was a real man. But that doesn't really help us in what we want to have faith in. We want to have faith in Jesus as the Son of God. We want to have faith in His deity. And the proof of that is His resurrection. So we've done all this now to get to a position where we can begin to look at Jesus. Was He actually the Son of God, or was He just a man? Appreciate you coming, and see you next week.
Hey, I got